Welcome back to Central Colorado Ballistics. My name is Wally. When most people picture the American West, they picture freedom, wide open land, new beginnings, John Wayne riding toward the horizon. But the real West wasn't lawless, and it wasn't free. In many ways, it was more controlled than the East. Because when you crossed into a territory, you didn't just cross geography, you crossed into someone else's rules. Now, before we go any further, let's set the stage. Imagine you've been on the trail for 4 months. Your rifle isn't political. It's not symbolic. It's how you hunted. It's how you kept animals away from your children at night. It's how you survived. And then you reach a town, and the first thing they tell you is to surrender it. This wasn't hypothetical. That was policy. People didn't go west because they were bored. They went because the East was crowded. The land was expensive. Jobs were scarce. For many families, the West wasn't adventure. It was survival. They sold everything, packed what they could carry, and took their families into the unknown. And they brought something with them: firearms. Not as a symbol, not as politics, but as tools. Protection, food, security on roads where help might be days away. What they didn't always realize was that the rules would change the moment they arrived. Now let's set the stage once again. Have you ever really thought about how exhausted people were back then? Imagine this: the distance your car covers in just 20 or 30 minutes. That's a full day's journey on foot or by wagon. And that's if nothing goes wrong along the way. Every mile means more time, more effort, and a lot more risk. Now let's take that a step further. Picture yourself always looking over your shoulder, scanning the horizon, listening for the sound of horses that might mean outlaws, or for wildlife lurking nearby. Your only comfort? That firearm. The firearm you brought from the big towns back east. It's been your constant companion, helping you fend off danger and fear throughout the journey. And now, imagine you finally made it to a town. Maybe it's lawless, and you're still watching your back, hoping you can keep your family safe. At least you have that trusted firearm. It's giving you some peace of mind. But then, as you reach the next town, a marshal or a sheriff stops you at the outskirts. They tell you to hand over your firearm and declare anything else you're carrying. What do? Do you trust this stranger with your family's safety? Or do you stay outside of town, risking the dangers of the outlaws and the wild animals? This is critical to understand. A U.S. territory is not a state. It has no full representation, no senators, no voting power in Congress, and yet it is governed by laws written far away. Territorial governors were appointed. Judges were appointed. Law enforcement answered upward, not locally. So when people entered a territory, they entered a system where consent was limited. They lived under rules they did not help create. And firearms were one of the first things regulated. Movies tell us everyone was armed and that no one cared. That isn't true. Many Western towns banned the carrying of firearms, especially within town limits. Visitors were required to check their gun with the sheriff. Some towns imposed fines, others jail time. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't folklore. And it wasn't a few isolated places. It was written down and enforced. Tombstone, Arizona. In 1881, the same year as the OK Corral, passed Ordinance Number 9. Carrying a firearm within the town limits was illegal. Visitors were required to deposit their weapons at a hotel, at a livery, or with the police. The gunfight didn't happen because there were no rules. It happened because officials were trying to enforce them. Dodge City, Kansas, a town famous for violence. They posted signs at its city limits. Visitors were instructed to leave their guns at the police headquarters or the livery stable. By 1882, fines were increased, specifically to reduce gunplay. Abilene, Kansas, during the time of Wild Bill Hickok, prohibited the carrying of firearms in town. Deadwood, South Dakota, restricted open carry, even during the height of the gold rush. These weren't eastern cities. They were frontier towns, cattle towns, rail towns, mining towns, places built by people who owned guns and depended on them. This wasn't anti-gun ideology. It was risk management. Dense populations, alcohol, transient labor, and no modern emergency services. So firearms were controlled. Not everywhere, but where people gathered. This wasn't about crime statistics. This was about control. Town leaders wanted order. They wanted commerce. They wanted to attract investment. And an armed transient population made them nervous. So rules were enforced on arrival. Sometimes posted, sometimes not. And ignorance was no defense. These laws weren't enforced evenly. Settled citizens were treated differently than newcomers. Merchants differently than laborers. Those with influence differently than those without. For families just arriving, the firearm they relied on for the journey could suddenly make them criminals, and refusal wasn't an option. You were in their jurisdiction now, and leaving wasn't always possible. This raises a question we rarely ask. Were these experiments? Did territorial authorities learn what worked? And what caused resistance? Because patterns begin to emerge. Control increases during instability. Restrictions justified as temporary, but rarely rolled back. And once a territory became a state, some of those rules followed. Others were rejected outright. Statehood wasn't just about borders. It was about deciding whose rules would survive. State lines weren't drawn randomly. They reflected economics, population, power, and sometimes disagreement. Different regions wanted different rules, different levels of control, and separation became the solution. This helps explain something modern audiences struggle with: why laws change at the border, and why crossing a line can suddenly change what's legal. When we reach Colorado, we won't be seeing something new. We'll be seeing something refined. Territorial authority, population growth, economic pressure, and people caught in the middle. People who didn't see themselves as radicals, just families trying to build a life, but discovering that freedom in the West came with conditions. So the West wasn't a blank slate. It was a testing ground for authority, for compliance, for resistance. And as territories became states, their lessons didn't disappear. They became precedent. In the next episode, we're going to slow down and look closely at Colorado, not as a modern battleground, but as a territory trying to control a growing population and discovering the limits of power. Freedom secured, rights defended.